I want to share with you the work that the committee did, because the committee's been doing a lot of work on this for a long time before we ever got to a visible product. Then we want to share with you your responses to the results of all the surveys that you filled out, so you can see as a whole what does the EMS staff here think of this. Start out, I just wanted, again, this little thing here, this slide shows that this is a product you guys see. It's an evaluation that's comprised of 8 different evaluation, work performance tasks. They are, 2 of them are the same, CPR, but otherwise, so there's 7 different work functions. But because anytime you put an evaluation in place like this within a department, it could be a manufacturing company or anything else, there are several federal regulations that you have to adhere to. We have to demonstrate that anything you're asked to do over there has a direct correlation with the essential critical functions of your job. We have to be able to point to that job description and say, they're doing this because that says they have to be able to do that. And then the second part of that is you can't just pull a job description out of the air. So if it's ever challenged, the courts are going to say, well, where did you come up with this job description? Did you do a thoughtful analysis of what the functions of that job are? This was all the work that the committee did, and it was a lot of work before we ever got to an actual product. And in the end run, if it's ever challenged, tomorrow, 10 years from now, somebody says, I don't think this work performance evaluation is an accurate representation of what I have to do as an EMS provider, or I think it unfairly discriminates against me or whatever, we would have to be able to demonstrate that this performance evaluation is directly related to this job description and that it's been linked together by a formal job task analysis. So to do that, we just started out by looking at job descriptions and looking at, what do we have to do? Now there's a lot of detail that goes into that because there are other federal laws. The Americans with Disability Act really dictates how we describe what your job is. And that's important because if we have somebody that applies for a job who has a disability and you have to make a decision whether or not you can hire that person or not, the law says you can't not offer a job to someone who's otherwise qualified for that job just because they have a disability, if it's reasonable to accommodate that. So because of that, we had to write tasks in a very concrete way. We had to identify what do you have to know, what are the skills you have to have, what are the abilities and personal characteristics, what are the tools you have to use, what are the conditions under which you might have to perform that job. So the committee did a lot of work in doing that job task analysis so that we can come up and say, this is a good representation, it's been thought through, it's been defensible and identifiable by what the job description says. Once we did that and we kind of put together a product, as a result of that job task analysis, they came up with 44 different unique tasks that would entail the scope of your job description. And those were common across both job classifications, paramedic or EMT. Now the way we were distinguishing them is because we would preface many of those tasks within the scope and limitations of licensure, certification, and training. So there are certain things a paramedic is going to do because their licensure allows them to do that an EMT might not. Every task that we came up with fell into one of these categories of domains of responsibility. This is really the breadth and the scope of services that Wayne Township provides to their community. The lion's share of your work fell into here, but you still have station duties, you still have drivers, you still have training, and you have apparatus and equipment maintenance, so there are some tasks that fell into there. So the next thing we had to do was decide which tasks can we take from there and come up with work functions that are related to those in the evaluation. The law says that it has to be a representation of the critical, essential functions of your work. It can't be, other duties. It might be one of your other duties to clean your apparatus. It might be another duty to cook on, every 3rd C shift, or to do station cleaning, things like that. That's part of the job, but it's not a critical function. So the committee took those 44 tasks and identified then which ones are what we consider to be critical and essential to performing EMS. There were 9 criteria, and those criteria were actually criteria that were given by the Americans with Disabilities Act as guidelines on how to determine if a task is a critical function of the job or not. From that, then we came up with about 28 tasks. Well, there were actually more that were considered to be essential, but we wanted to only use tasks that we had a really strong consensus. We had 6 people on the committee, so I didn't want to pick a task where 50% said that's an essential function and 50% said that's not. We wanted a strong consensus. The criteria was it had to be at least a 75% consensus that the committee felt this is an essential part of our job. In fact, we had 28 that we used in the pool. The minimum consensus on those 28 was 83% of the committee would say that's an essential function. The average is 91. So the reason for that is very important because we don't want any equivocation about what we're doing over there. We don't want any equivocation about what we're doing over there being tied to a critical component of your job. We wanted to have a strong consensus in the opinions of the people who do the job every day. So, when we came up with those 8 different work behaviors, some of those are just, taking equipment off the apparatus, getting to the scene of where the emergency is, maneuvering a patient, an unconscious patient, performing CPR, maneuvering someone who's a conscious patient in a stair chair, and so on. Those work behaviors, the 8 work behaviors, were linked directly to 6 of those 28 tasks. So for every work behavior over there, if we're ever asked, we have the data that can show this work function is directly related to this task. And some of them are actually related to more than one task. So that's where, when I showed you that slide about connecting those chain links, that's how we connected those and can demonstrate and defend that those are relevant activities. And there's the activities. You guys have seen it. As you recall, we went through this twice, and the reason is because after the first time we made a modification to one work function with the stair chair carrier. And we changed that so that it would be in more compliance with safe usage practices of how to handle a stair chair. We typically wouldn't have maybe someone just by themselves bringing a loaded patient downstairs in a stair chair. So, after we've done that, that's when we brought all of you through this, because we want to now corroborate the opinions of the committee, get the opinions of the entire department to determine and demonstrate that in your opinions also, this is a valid representation. And that's all it has to be. It's a representation. It doesn't entail everything you do, but a representation of the critical components of your job. There's 3 criteria by which we evaluate that. One is we just simply ask. Each individual work function that you do over there, we asked you, in your opinion, is that a critical task? And how critical is it? We had a scale that you rated it on. Was it a physically demanding task? And we asked that because this is a physical work performance evaluation. So there are certain tasks that you do that are very critical but have no physical component at all. If you're trying to calculate perhaps maybe a medication dosage or something like that, you better really know what you're doing because it's important. But it's not a physically demanding task. And then the last thing was, how similar is each one of those work functions to the way you would perform that on an emergency scene? That's really important because this is a content validation study. It just means we're trying to replicate the content of your job. It's what we call in our field the quack test. If we're trying to replicate a duck, then we better make sure to dress it up. It's got some feathers, a beak, and it waddles and quacks. So we want to know each one of those. We asked you, is it similar to what would happen on a real scene? We know it's rarely ever going to be exactly the same because you just can't duplicate that. Once we're able to demonstrate that it's, in your opinions, a valid representation of the critical aspects of your job, the last thing we had to decide then is, okay, what is a reasonable expectation of performance? And in this industry, just like in fire, because this is emergency services, time matters. Time matters in the length of time that it takes to perform certain tasks. The way we did that, as you recall, everybody that went through the evaluation, we videotaped them. Then I took those videotapes and I ranked them from fastest to slowest, and we pulled out 6. They were separated apart by a certain length of time. I'll show you the slides here in a minute. And then we had the committee review those. In addition, we also had 3 administrative people come in and serve on that as reviewing the videos. And then they, from there, made a judgment on what is an acceptable and non-acceptable standard. So we'll go into that detail in a minute. What I want to show you now are your
representation.
Pardon?
And we have union representation.
Yeah. Well, the last one, the union didn't show up. They were invited. So when we administered those surveys, the first thing we asked you was, after you went through the walkthrough and they explained, okay, here's what we're doing, here's how we want you to do it, we wanted to find out, did you understand that? Because if you didn't understand what we wanted you to do, then everything behind that doesn't really matter. Fortunately, in our case, we had 100% consensus. Everybody either agreed or strongly agreed that they understood how they were to complete those specific tasks. So the next question was, well, if you understood how to do it, did you actually perform those in a manner that you felt was consistent with how you perform on an emergency scene? Because that's what we were asking you to do. Go out here and do it the way you would feel like you would be expected to do it on a real emergency scene. And again, we had 100% consensus between agree and strongly agree that, yep, I did it the way I felt like I would do it if I was on an emergency scene. So, if you remember, we asked you those questions about criticality, physicality, and similarity on each individual work function. Equipment carry, CPR, dummy drag, all those things. But we also asked you at the end, what's your opinion of the evaluation as a whole? So the sum of those 8 parts, how critical overall would you say that evaluation was? Was it a good representation of important aspects of your job? So this looks at the overall criticality rating. And we had 100% actually rated the overall evaluation as representation of important to extremely critical aspects of your job. That's a real, that's strong data. That's exactly what we wanted to have. We had people saying, hey, this stuff doesn't matter, or doesn't matter very much, then we picked the wrong stuff. So it commends the work of the committee. That's why they're subject matter experts that are on the committee, because they know what it is you're out there having to do. The next question was, overall, after you got through all 8 of those functions, how physically demanding do you think that was? And you can see here, it varies, but mostly it gravitates to the middle. It's sort of a moderate to a little bit, you know, we have 75, 85% said it fell somewhere between moderate to excessive effort to get through the whole evaluation. There were some people who said, not too tough at all. And then we had some people over here who said, that is extremely difficult. But being a physical evaluation, we want it to fall in this area. The important thing is the next question is, was it similar? Because if it's physically demanding but it isn't similar at all, then we've missed the boat on that. So we're going to look at that, and we asked you overall, how similar then is what you did over there with all those 8 functions to what you would do out on an emergency scene. And boom, we've got great data here where the overwhelming majority, 64%, said that's really very, very similar, highly similar. Some said it was exactly the same. And there were a few who said, yeah, it's somewhat similar. There was only one person or one acknowledgement that they thought, yeah, it's kind of similar but not very much. But as a population, we did a good job of it falling in to here. We don't expect this to be the highest bar ever, because we know we can't go out and exactly duplicate everything that's going on in an emergency scene. So that's where we evaluate and look at the evaluation as a whole. We say, well, pretty well as a whole, we got some very good data to show that that's a good representation of the kind of work you do. It involves the physical demanding aspects of it. But we want to look at each individual task and say, can each one of those chain links stand up under their own scrutiny? So we looked at each one. Is each event considered to be a critical task? Now, when we see these 100%, we're saying 100% of the people who came through rated each of those tasks, in this case, as important to extremely critical. That's what we want. It looks like there's a couple of them here that are way down, but because these are so high, really, we still have 86%. An overwhelming majority said even getting a backboard, if it comes to the time where you need a backboard, getting a backboard is pretty darn important. If it comes to time you need to transport a victim, being able to do that, 93%, that's important to extremely critical. What do you do if you can't transport it? That's going to be a problem. So every one of those tasks in that respect that was selected by the committee are able to stand on their own as important tasks to the functions of your job. So then, were they physically demanding? And you can see it kind of goes up and down. Well, that's okay. If that's the way your job is, and the tasks that you have to perform, some are tougher than others. As you can see here, boom, one, backboard retrieval, not tough at all. And it really wasn't intended to be tough. Because of the way you function as a department when you're performing CPR, you do 2 minutes on, you do 2 minutes off to recover, then you do 2 minutes on after your partner then is doing the 2 minutes off and recovering. The question that I posed to the committee is it plausible that during those 2 minutes, the person that's recovering would do any other kind of meaningful work? And the answer was, yeah. You may go back and maybe get something else that you need from off the rig or whatever. And so we came up with, let's have them go get a backboard, bring it back in case you need to transport them on a backboard, and then wait the remaining period of time until you come back into your second cycle of CPR. So this is what each one of those looks like as far as physicality. You know, the overall, 89% said it was moderate to extremely effort. The toughest thing was moving that patient. You know, and you all know moving unconscious weight, and I don't say necessarily dead weight, can be really, really difficult. So let's look then at the similarity of those events. Did we do a good job on each individual event making them similar? And boom, we couldn't ask for better data than this. And this is all of your opinions. You know, with a department this small, or this, we didn't ask a sample of people and then try to extrapolate what everybody else thought. We asked everybody these questions, and this was the answers of everybody. It was somewhat to exactly the same, 100%, 93, 93, 96. We have great data. So when we look at this, we can say, if we had to explain to anybody, whether it's just firefighters here, like we're showing, or if we had to go to a court and show this to a judge, we've got tremendous data that can say, this evaluation is comprised of, in the opinions of the people who perform the job for Wayne Township, very important functions of their job. It's very similar to the way they have to perform their job, and it has a physically demanding component to the aspects of their job. It's representative of the physical demanding aspects of it. So the next thing we have to ask ourselves then is, okay, what is a reasonable expectation of performance? And I touched on that earlier. We videotaped everyone. We took the very fastest time, and then we took from there, which was 8:59, we went down to the very last tape, in this case, which was 11:26. We selected tapes that were every, I tried to get every 20 to 30, 40 seconds apart. It just depends on where the tapes fall. And the reason for that is we have two tapes. This was 8:59 and this was 9:05. You're not going to be able to really discern that there's any difference, perhaps, in the rate of those tapes. The committee was instructed to rate the pace, evaluate the pace or the rate at which work was getting done. Okay, we don't care about necessarily the level of exertion that's required to do that, or the lack of exertion that's required to do that, because on an emergency scene, the only thing that counts is it getting done or not? If you do something and it just brings you down to butter and toasts you because it was so hard, but you did it the way it had to be done, and Kelly does it, and it's tough, but it isn't exhausting to her, and she gets it done the same quality that you get it done, then the outcomes, for all practical purposes, are going to be the same. The level of effort that was required on your part becomes irrelevant. That's why all we're trying to focus here on is the rate. Therefore, the committee was made aware that nobody knew the times, but they were informed that the first tape that they're going to see is going to be the fastest video that they'll see in the whole group. Every video after that is going to be progressively slower to some degree, because I don't want them to have to sit there and discern based on well, they looked like they were working hard, they looked like they were walking fast, but their legs are half the length of the guys before who was walking at half the stride rate. And so they're trying to discern and perceive who did this faster or who did it slower. I want them to know that up front, so it eliminates all those other things. They were then, at the conclusion of each video, asked to rate that video, that performance, as that pace at which they performed those tasks was either acceptable, flat out, good to go, any day, any circumstance, that's good. Marginally acceptable, it's close, and we'll count it, but much slower than that wouldn't be what we would want to have on our on Wayne Township emergency scene. The next rating was marginally unacceptable. It's just not quite good enough. We're not comfortable putting people out there that can't work at a better pace than that. Or flat out, that's just never going to be good or acceptable on the services that we want to provide to our community. Each one of those ratings was given a point value. So if they said, okay, this video is flat out, hands down good, that's acceptable, it was given a point value of 4. If it was rated as marginally acceptable, it was given a point value of 3. Marginally unacceptable was given a point value of 2. And then unacceptable was given a point value of 1. We had 9 evaluators, so we had 9 opinions for each video that was watched. I took the point value that corresponded with their rating, added those up, and divided them by 9 and came up with what we call a time-weighted average. What our goal was is to achieve or to identify a time that correlated with 3.0, marginally acceptable, okay? So the law says we have to just come up with a standard that is consistent with reasonable expectation of the job. So we're not trying to identify, hey, what's optimal or what's best. We're trying to identify what's the minimal level of performance that we think is acceptable for us to put out there on an emergency scene. So we're looking for a rating of 3.0. And as you can see, here we had a 3.3. So the collective opinion of the committee thought this was less acceptable than that. And probably, and I can't speak for the individuals because I don't know what their thoughts were, but I'm going to surmise, someone may have thought, that's too fast. That could jeopardize the safety of the patient, or it violates maybe a standard operating procedure. But the collective opinions weren't as strong for that as they were for the next one, 3.6. And then we see we've got a 3.4, 3.6. So we're pretty much almost flatlined through here. They still thought, hey, these are all pretty good. But we see a clear and sharp drop from tape 4 of 1004 to tape 6 of 1126. And between 1004 and 1040, we went from a 3.6 rating, collective rating, to a collective rating of 2.9. We're looking for 3.0. Sometimes I've worked with departments where there's a video that actually comes out to be a perfect time-weighted average of 3.0. And so if that's the case, we can say, all right, boom, that's our cutoff time. But in this case, we know that somewhere between 3.6 and 2.9 lies 3.0. Somewhere between 1004 and 1040 lies an acceptable time. So how do we get to that? I do a mathematical calculation to extrapolate where that time would lie. Without going into details, then I'll tell you that the methodology that I follow on that, and actually I follow the entire validation process, is the methodology that was established and used by the International Association of Firefighters and the International Association of Fire Chiefs in developing and validating and coming up with a cutoff time for their candidate physical abilities test. That was done in conjunction with, in consultation with the Department of Justice and the EEOC. I've been involved in task force meetings when we were doing all of that. I've listened to their legal counsel on that process, and so there's been a precedent set on a national level for the methodology for establishing the kind of evaluation. So that's how we did. We followed the exact same methodology that they did at right out of the book. So the cutoff time then now is 1026, which means when we go through it, and they implement this as a part of their department SOP, as you go through, your expectation will be that you can complete it in 1026 or less. Okay? Today, we're going to let everybody go over there and go through it and give you their time, just so you now have somewhat of a benchmark. Okay, before, you didn't really know what you were shooting for. We just said, do it the way you think you would be expected to do it, or would do it on an emergency scene. Now, you have a target, okay? So the department wants you to have plenty of time to come in there to do it, see where you fall. If it's 10:26 and you do it in 9:15, then boom, you don't have anything to worry about. If it's 10:26 and you do it in 10:30, you know that, well, hey, that's pretty close. I may need to do some preparations before it actually comes into full play within the department. I think it'll be a year from the time we get through all of this, and everybody has a time and they know, well, here's where I was last time. I know I'm good to go, or I've got some work to do. You'll have a year to prepare for it before they actually implement it.